And welcome to today's webinar, Managing Modern Slavery Risk, SMETA, Legal Expectations and Practical Applications. My name is Swashna Pan, and I'll be your host for today's session. In the spirit of reconciliation, BSI Group acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Thank you for joining us. So you are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to participate throughout today's webinar by submitting your questions using the questions panel. We'll answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end, and any unanswered questions will be followed up after the webinar. A recording of today's session will also be shared with all the registered attendees. And we'd also encourage you to participate in today's poll, which will appear on your screen during the webinar. Please bear with us if we experience any technical difficulties. We'll work quickly to resolve them. Today's webinar will explore the growing expectations around modern slavery, due diligence, recent legal developments and practical approaches to identifying and managing risk within global supply chains. We'll discuss how organizations can strengthen supplier oversight, understand the value of SMETA audits, and prepare for evolving regulatory and customer expectations. With this, I'm now pleased to introduce our first speaker, Roxanne Fish. Roxanne is a partner and accredited specialist, employment and industrial law with Hamilton Locke. She practices and is recognised by the Law Society of New South Wales as an accredited specialist in employment and industrial law. She does have extensive experience advising employers on employment law, workplace health and safety, industrial relations, regulatory compliance, workplace investigations, discrimination, harassment, and psychosocial hazards. Roxanne has also worked in leading international law firms, specialist employment practices, and in-house for a national construction company, as well as practicing law in London for 5 years. Today, Roxanne will run us through and discuss the evolving legal landscape surrounding modern slavery, employer responsibilities, and the practical implications of current and emerging legislation. Thank you all. Please join me in welcoming Roxanne. Over to you.
Thank you for that very warm introduction. Appreciate it, and very happy to be here. Thank you to BSI for hosting me today, and to my fellow panelists, thank you as well. So I'll kick off just by talking very briefly, if I could get the first slide up, just in terms of what I expect to cover in my presentation. So as you can see there, just really setting the scene around the modern slavery environment across the globe. Then I'll talk briefly about the legal framework, both from a Commonwealth perspective as well as New South Wales, and then talk to really the heart of what we're discussing today, which is supply chain management and what that looks like from a best practice solution perspective, and then we'll dig into some practical measures. So let's get to it. Just getting to the next slide. Thank you. So what you can see up here is really casting a window into what is the current situation around modern slavery. So this comes from a report in 2025, so it's a little bit out of date, but I don't expect the statistics will have changed much. You can see across the globe there's some statistics around forced labour, forced marriage. The relevant numbers are quite significant. And then when we're looking from an Australian and New Zealand context, you can see there 41,000 people living in modern slavery in Australia. A 2025 report actually, which was published by the Australian Institute of Criminology, found that out of the majority of 420 Australian Federal Police reports, 67% of those represented slavery and slavery-like offences, with trafficking offences representing about 33%. Other interesting findings suggested almost 2/3 of reports related to allegations in New South Wales and Victoria, so the large states, with females making up 87% of identified suspected victim survivors. So those are quite stark statistics that we're looking at. Of course, from an Australian and New Zealand context, the global sources of modern slavery are particularly relevant to the commercial context in which businesses operate, where the source material or the labour used to produce material comes from outside of Australia or New Zealand, with differing laws and standards that apply. So we operate in an increasingly complex global environment, which requires more awareness about supply chain risks and oversight, and more proactive processes in terms of reducing modern slavery. So that includes considering supply chains both in the context of the manufacture and supply of the final product, but also in the context of what goes into making the relevant materials from the initial components of a relevant product. So on to the next slide, which essentially highlights the forms in which modern slavery can take. So I don't propose, just in the interest of time, to go into each of the relevant types of what is the modern slavery, but there are statutory definitions for reference in both the Commonwealth and New South Wales legislation around what is modern slavery. They differ slightly in terms of the context of what that is. From a Commonwealth perspective, modern slavery includes some of the ones up there: slavery offences, servitude, which is basically where a person is coerced or threatened so that a reasonable person would not consider themselves free to cease providing services or labour. Forced labour, of course, there's deceptive recruiting of labour, forced marriage, debt bondage, and trafficking in persons, and the worst forms of child labour. The Commonwealth legislation establishes the Commonwealth Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and that's tasked with a range of functions, but essentially is not able to investigate or prosecute allegations of modern slavery, which I'll come to in a minute. So the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's speech in 2025 highlighted those three aspects of why it's so important to consider modern slavery. From a human rights perspective, of course, in terms of first and foremost grave human rights violations, we're talking about, more than economic exploitation. It's the theft of liberty, personal agency, and self-determination. In many situations, it deprives a person of their basic freedoms. And from an economic perspective, there are estimated illegal profits at a staggering $236 billion a year. And then, of course, from a business perspective, which is why we're here today, and understanding modern slavery is really good for business and good for investors. So increasingly, we're seeing companies take a real interest in these issues from an investor perspective, in terms of the business risk, legal, ethical, and reputational risks. Companies can face significant damage as a result of exposure to modern slavery within their supply chains. So I'll move on to the next slide, please, which is looking in a little bit more depth at the Commonwealth legislative requirements. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we can see here, which I'm sure, just go back one to the Commonwealth part first. So as you can see, I'm sure most of the businesses online would be aware that there are certain businesses that are required to report on their actions taken to address modern slavery. So of those businesses, those that are considered to be a reporting entity are required to prepare a modern slavery statement. And that is essentially an Australian entity with an annual consolidated revenue of $100 million. And there's a number of small other categories which are included in that definition. And then you can see on the right-hand side, Section 16 of the Commonwealth Act sets out a number of different criteria which are required to be included in a modern slavery statement. And essentially, preparing a modern slavery statement sounds simple, but it's not. It really requires a considered and thorough process to ensure that the statement itself accurately reflects an organization's corporate structure, its business operations and supply chains. It really requires an organization to have undertaken a risk assessment process to identify and address modern slavery risks. Where an organization prepares a joint statement as part of a corporate group, additional input will also be required, and consultation needs to occur across multiple stakeholders across an organization. And the requirement under the Commonwealth legislation is that the report in slavery statement has to be submitted within 6 months of the end of the relevant financial reporting period applicable to that entity. So going on to the New South Wales requirements, these commenced on the next slide, please. Thank you. On the 1st of January 2022, essentially New South Wales established the first state regime to address modern slavery, but there was a bit of a delay in the commencement of the legislation because of the Commonwealth coming into effect. So there were some changes which occurred that were different to what was in its original bill, due to commence. So the key difference, I guess, between the Commonwealth and the New South Wales obligations is that commercial organisations under New South Wales do not have, as a general rule, to report under the New South Wales legislation. There's no financial penalties for failing to comply with the reporting requirements. So New South Wales government agencies must report, and state-owned corporations are required to voluntarily report under the Commonwealth Act. A state-owned corporation includes New South Wales government-owned corporations such as energy, water, ports, and forestry. And relevantly, which is also a key difference between the two acts, is that there's no threshold, there's no revenue threshold required for entities, for the reporting entity. The other difference is that state-owned corporations are barred from revoking their commitment to voluntarily report. So unlike the Commonwealth Act, there's no specific reporting criteria included in the New South Wales Act, which sets out requirements for what should be included in the modern slavery statements. And similarly to the Commonwealth, the New South Wales establishes the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner. And I've put on the slide there on the right-hand side some of the tasks that included within the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, with broad oversight over the government to monitor relevant policies and actions in combating modern slavery. So I'll go to the next slide, which is deals with the non-compliance and offences. At the heart of this, what's really key to understand is that there are not particularly onerous obligations on companies in terms of financial penalties enforcement approaches currently. But you'll see I'll come to the proposals of the governments shortly. So really the non-compliance with either the Commonwealth and the New South Wales Act results in, corporations being listed on the relevant Minister for Home Affairs register. There's the opportunity for the Home Affairs Minister to ask for an explanation about a failure to report. So they're not particularly onerous compliance or enforcement obligations. The real heart of the criminal aspects sit within those particular, at the bottom of the slide, the 4 pieces of legislation which relates to, the criminal conduct. In addition to the above, of course, we have, in my area, the Australian Employment and Safety Landscape, which offers minimum protections for employees and oversight by the relevant regulators to ensure compliance and potential civil penalties. That obviously includes a number of enforcement mechanisms in these areas. Next slide, please. So as I've highlighted initially, there are, of course, some limitations in the way in which the current regime operates, and that has been discussed at several times throughout the last number of years through a number of different reports, a number of different government regulations. So relevantly, there was a 2023 review conducted into the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act, and that similarly identified a number of weaknesses in the operation of the Act, and it made 30 recommendations for improvement, including a mandatory due diligence process, which was one of the recommendations to come out of that. In 2024, the government published its response to that statutory review, agreeing in part to a majority, 25 out of the 30 recommendations, and a public consultation process followed, which concluded in late 2025. And then just recently, going on to the next slide, excuse me, the government has announced less than 2 weeks ago around expected reforms that will come underway. We expect in the next 6 months or so, which will be a significant change to the way in which the modern slavery is currently enforced. So we haven't seen the detail, but there is proposed to be a new criminal offence where companies fail to report in terms of the mandatory reporting criteria. And it will only apply, as far as we understand at the moment, to those companies who are required to report currently. So that is those who are captured by the current threshold revenue requirement. So relevantly, the offence will require those companies to demonstrate that they've taken reasonable steps to ensure to prevent modern slavery in their domestic supply chains. And the offence will require those aspects to be complied with. There will also be civil penalties. We don't know what those will be yet, but it's indicative of this enhanced enforcement process. So it's a real watch this space process, and remains to be seen what the detail will be. So I just want to go really quickly, just conscious of time, to the next slide, which is really the crux of what we're here to discuss, and that is supply chain management. So how should you respond now in anticipation of the increasing regulatory scrutiny of business supply chains? It's really incumbent on businesses to combat modern slavery and to ensure that they have robust systems in place to prevent that from occurring. Appropriate due diligence is key on potential suppliers. It's an imperative component. And as part of that, it requires an undertaking of risk assessment. So that includes, for example, requests for information, verification of suppliers' legal standing, auditing financial statements, reviewing regulatory litigation and bankruptcy databases, sanctions screening, and other relevant processes. It means identifying and assessing risks to map their supply chains from tier ones through to raw material sources, to identify where the risks and forced labor or exploitation is most likely to occur. It should be conducted across regions and across categories in your business. Preventing and mitigating harm is also really important in making sure that there is ethical sourcing decisions, balancing commercial priorities against human rights obligations. So it may involve reviewing supplier codes of conduct, improving purchasing practices, and ensuring workers across the supply chain have safe and accessible channels to raise concern. You should be tracking effectiveness and then, of course, remediating and reporting on those aspects. Next slide, please. Just want to really quickly touch on, and I'm sure we'll be given these slides afterwards. We've got a lot of detail in there around a recent case, not so recent, a 2025 example of these issues being live issues. So Australian glove maker Ansell Limited became the subject of a formal complaint, which was lodged by the international labour activist Andy Hall. He alleged that 220 Bangladeshi migrant workers at its Malaysian supplier Mediceram suffered serious abuses of fundamental worker and human rights. So Mediceram manufactured the ceramic hand-shaped gloves molds, which are used in the glove production process. The alleged abuses were wide-ranging and particularly severe. And when a number of those workers raised the complaints, they were allegedly sacked and reported. And the complaints, the allegation is that Ansell's due diligence measures failed to prevent the forced labour and retribution. And Ansell confirmed it had investigated Mediceram and acknowledged breaches of international labour standards and its own supplier code of conduct. It stated it wouldn't walk away from Mediceram and instead prepaid for over a year's worth of stock to enable Mediceram to fund a remediation and repayment package. And in March 2026, the Oz NCP established the final statement by the independent examiner, which decided that the complaint would not be accepted for further consideration. And the reasons were that Ansell had essentially provided evidence which reflected an awareness of its responsible business conduct expectations and a number of remediation approaches that it had promised to undertake. And I'll just stop there because there is another case, but I'm just conscious of time for my fellow participants, and just go to the next slide, which is just the last one that I was proposing to talk about. And this is really key in ensuring that every business has an appropriate risk management approach, in ensuring that not only from a business and ethical practice management that they ensure modern slavery doesn't apply, but also from a regulatory perspective in light of the enhanced regulatory approaches that are being undertaken and proposed at the moment. That includes understanding the risks of how modern slavery relates to your organization's business model and operating context, developing policies that influence decision makers, and considering the need to develop new ones specifically to address modern slavery in supply chains. Due diligence, again, is a really important one in making sure that you understand the business relationships, and the focus should be on mitigating rather than avoiding modern slavery risks. And then, of course, building engagement with your supply chains. Preventing modern slavery is not achievable with any business alone. It requires strategic management across stakeholders. And then an ongoing review is really the key, ensuring that these issues are front of mind and are consistently considered on a regular basis. Thank you very much. I'll pass over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Roxanne, for sharing those valuable legal insights. Our next speaker is Alexander Walrat. He's the head of Japan, Australia, and New Zealand at SEDEX. Alex helps organizations navigate increasing regulatory and market expectations around ethical sourcing and supply chain transparency. Draws on his experience across fintech and regtech. He's worked with businesses to transform complex sustainability and ESG requirements into practical data-driven solutions using the SEDEX platform and SMETA methodology. Today, Alex will explore how organizations can strengthen supply chain transparency and leverage SMETA to build more resilient and responsible supply chains. Thanks, everyone. Please welcome Alex. Over to you.
Thanks, Rosna. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex from SEDEX, and to kick things off, firstly, what is SEDEX? Why are we here? Next slide, please. So whilst the conversation is obviously around modern slavery, it's worth noting that the tools that have been developed to handle this, and one of them is SEDEX, predates modern slavery legislation. What we're talking about is a tool designed to help with risk assessing supply chains from a labour standards, OH&S, environmental and ethical perspective. Why? Because these issues tend not to exist in isolation and people tend not to look for them in isolation. And that's probably the key point I want to make as part of today's presentation. Think of risk holistically. Think of a broad range of factors at play. Next slide, please. So SEDEX is a data exchange. We have over 100,000 members across 120,000 places of economic activity. And last year, there were over 70,000 social compliance audits, of which BSCI is one of the major auditing partners. And as you can see, we have global offices. Why? Because people have global supply chains. Next slide. And lots of organizations are members of SEDEX. But the key thing to note is that they all use it for a variety of different reasons. Some of them will risk assess a small percentage of their suppliers. Others will look at a vast number. Why? Because they all take a risk-based approach. It's understanding what your supply chain looks like, what are the circumstances, and taking an approach that is fit for purpose. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. Next slide, please. So I'm talking to you because SEDEX fundamentally is a platform to reduce duplication. People undertake due diligence, be it self-assessment questionnaire or an audit conducted by BSI or others, and that is added to the platform. That is then shared with multiple parties. Now, the key thing to note is it's not a certification. Why? Because you can't, from our perspective, take a pass-fail approach. This is an iterative exercise. And it's about sharing information to help understand risk and then have a conversation about what to do about it. Next slide, please. So there's three key players in the space. You have suppliers. You could be a supplier to another member, or we could be talking about your suppliers. So you've got buyers and suppliers, information flowing between them. And then you have auditors like BSI conducting SMETA audits or possibly against other standards. And then you've got firms like Hamilton Locke stepping in and supporting from a consulting and knowledge-based perspective. SEDEX is here as a platform to facilitate that flow of information. But, next slide. Why does this matter? Next slide. Because there's a range of factors that are driving this agenda. So we've talked about Roxanne has spoken about the legislation, thank you, but let's talk about some of the other factors at play. So in addition to government targets, you've got some of the geopolitical issues at play. You've got due diligence legislation. You've got increasing public and private actor activities, like, for instance, NGOs doing, for instance, the Ethical Fashion Guide or the Chocolate Scorecard, amongst other things. You've got stock exchanges with requirements around ESG. You've got loans and syndicated loans being issued that have covenants around ESG and or due diligence requirements, and brands and major organizations, including ones that are members of SEDEX, are cascading requirements down to suppliers. So just because you may not be a reporting entity does not mean you don't deal with ones who have those expectations, and they will bring those to your attention. Next slide, please. So let's talk a bit about some of those trends. Next slide. This is not just Australia. This is happening across the world, and it is becoming more and more prevalent. Most recently, we're talking to Thailand, we're talking to Indonesia about their legislation they're looking to introduce. Australia, as Roxanne has said, is looking to strengthen its act. New Zealand has one before the House at the moment. The trend here is towards greater due diligence, disclosure, and import restrictions. So the trend is very much in favor of and heading towards greater due diligence, greater requirements, more explicit due diligence activities. Next slide, please. And a good example of that, you would have seen recently that Australia has been, or is going to be hit with tariffs, amongst other countries, for not doing enough from a US perspective around forced labor. And this has prompted a range of activities, and possibly one of the reasons why the government has moved. But again, New Zealand also moving. Next slide, please. And you've got regulators. So this is from the Federal Anti-Slavery Commissioner flagging to law firms his concerns. This was last year. Next slide, please. And now to Roxanne's point, penalties coming. Next slide. So let me give you some real-world examples. Next slide. Here's another organization in Malaysia, ATA, supplier to Dyson. You can see in their share price where things came out. So this is 2021. Next slide. You can see the share price in August 2025. The discussion continues. Next slide. And now a group of employees have taken Dyson to court in the UK and settled. So this is the customer of the supplier in question settling a dispute. How far could this possibly go? Could this extend to you? It's an interesting question. But the key thing I want to emphasize here is the risk, and the fact that the risk is changing and how organizations manage this risk, and market expectations are changing as well. Next slide. So a couple of days ago, major suppliers to some major US brands getting hit with forced labor ban. In other words, the goods can't be imported. Imagine the costs associated with that. Next slide, please. And let's not forget that this is not an overseas problem, not exclusively. This happens here as well. This is part of the reason why we need to be undertaking these kind of due diligence activities. Here's two recent examples around labour hire. Labour hire in the Adelaide Hills. 92% of labour hire providers audited in South Australia were non-compliant. 80% of hort businesses in some of Victoria's biggest growing regions, non-compliant. That's not a minority, that's the majority. This is systemic. This is why you need to be looking, because if you don't manage these risks, they will come back to potentially bite you. Next slide. And it captures even governments. So here's a major organisation that was hit by deregistered by the Victorian Labour Hire Authority, which is also becoming more active. Next slide. And a recent report by Migrant Justice saying that 36 in every 100 migrant workers are paid below the minimum wage. Over 1 in 3 is getting less than what they are legally entitled to in Australia. So again, this is not an isolated issue. This is systemic, and organisations are looking. And they may ask you, and you may be asked. Next question. And the thing is that these issues don't happen in isolation. People don't just look to cut wages. They might have OH&S related issues. There could be a whole range of issues at play. And this is, again, why things like social compliance auditing is important, because it's finding a broad range of issues, not just one specific niche. And all of those could potentially be a risk to you and your business. And this is what SEDEX and SMETA audits are ultimately about. They're here to provide you with that information so you can make a fair and objective assessment of what is happening. Over 50% of the non-conformances, these are basically issues that have been identified, relate to health and safety. You would have seen recently in news, workers killed, run over by forklifts, for instance. We're talking about electrical and fire safety issues. It's not just that pointy end of forced labour, but there's a whole range of impacts that have harm to workers that could lead to lost morale and productivity, fines, insurance claims, threats to your business, threats to your workers, threats to the financial viability of it. So again, think of it holistically. Think of what these risks mean. Next slide. And if you use SEDEX, you're in good company, because 10% of modern slavery statements do reference SEDEX. Next slide. So let's talk very briefly about SMETA before I hand over to Ram to give you the details. Next slide. So SMETA is the SEDEX members' ethical trade audit. It's not a pass-fail assessment. It is looking at 4 pillars. So again, labour standards, and that modern slavery piece sits within that: health and safety, ethics, and environment. Next slide. And these are all the different things that it covers as part of a 2 or a 4-pillar audit. And so you can see we're looking at more than just, is recruitment freely chosen, but a range of other factors. Next slide. But the one thing I would emphasize is that you need to see it as more than just a legal compliance assessment. This is looking at ethical trade as well. And so, as Roxanne could probably tell you, working hours in Australia, there's no hard limit, I believe. But if you're looking at the ethical trade arm of a SMETA audit, we're looking at a limit of 60 hours over a 7-day period. So you can have a situation where a non-conformance is legal under the Australian law, but it breaches that ethical trade arm. And these are the kind of things to consider, that the standard may not just be what is legally mandated. There could be a higher standard that is being cascaded down by your customers. For instance, around overtime premiums, around working hours. And so if you think about it purely as a legal exercise, you're possibly going down the wrong path, because people are looking at a broader set of risks and a broader approach. And so from that, let me hand over to Ram to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was really, really good. Our final presenter today is Ram Amunga. He's a technical specialist for Food and SMETA Scheme Manager for Australia and New Zealand at BSI. Ram provides technical leadership and guidance to clients, auditors, and stakeholders across BSI's food and supply chain assurance services. As BSI SMETA Scheme Manager, he works closely with organisations to support audit delivery, technical interpretation, and best practice implementation. So today, Ram will share practical guidance on preparing for SMETA audits, some common findings, and how organisations can use SMETA as a part of a broader approach to managing modern slavery risk. So thanks, everyone. Please join me in welcoming Ram. Over to you.
Thank you, Sashna. Thank you, everyone. I'll talk briefly on who is responsible for SMETA audits, what are the states involved, how to engage with audit providers effectively if you're thinking about taking this path, so that your organization can then be able to map out all those risks that you have already heard about. Next slide, please. Before I do that, may I just ask how familiar are you with this meta audit process? Are you, yeah, if you can take a moment and just, thank you can see numbers coming up there. Excellent. Thank you all. That's a good overview of where we are all in this journey. And thank you for answering that. Next slide. So, who is responsible for SMETA audits? I'll say that basically the affiliate audit companies, or commonly known as certification bodies, are responsible for the planning, delivery, and reporting of SMETA audit. That's on the, on the implementation side of it, just to get you into it. So if you're thinking about taking this path, then a certification body will be responsible to help you in the planning, delivering, and reporting of that SMETA audit. But to achieve this, CBs must work collaboratively with suppliers so that we ensure those audits are planned and delivered within the guidelines from SEDEX, from APSCA, from yourself, the suppliers, and even your audit requester who may be a buying company. So we have those set of requirements, and for us to ensure that that audit, it's not just about doing the audit, but you want to be sure that the audit you have done or undergone is admissible, it's acceptable. And so it meets those basic minimum requirements that are set out by those organizations that I've just briefly listed there. So, and to a successful completion of a SMETA audit, which is basically applying the SMETA methodology, looks at the management systems assessment that you have in place. It looks at the work-based requirements, as well as the additional data points that your organization has. So this in itself is a practical step in mapping out where your site sits when we are talking about modern slavery risk. So next slide, please. So related to the past slide, my second question will be, who do you believe has the primary responsibility for a successful SMETA audit? Is it the auditor? Is it the certification body? Is it the buying company? Yeah. Is it the supplier? Or is it a collaborative requirement? Yeah, thank you for those responses there. One more minute. Yeah, I think we are done. Yeah, and I think I agree with the majority of you. As we said, it requires a collaborative approach. Without the input of the supplier being able to provide the initial information about your site, a certification body cannot be able to tailor the audit that then will be acceptable to those who have requested that audit from you. So we all work collaboratively to be able to deliver the audit that then will be admissible. Next will be, when are the SMETA audits required? And as I've already said, of course, it is previous. The first step is where you have an audit requester that may come to you, and this can be either a buying company, right, or it can be yourself as a site. You are being proactive and you want to go ahead and just ensure that you've identified any risks within your operations. So, and in doing so, there are some basics that I would like you to know. One is that you have to determine by discussing with your audit requester or your buying companies or your partners, are you going for which audit structure are you going to take? Is it going to be a 2-pillar, a 3-pillar, a 4-pillar? 3-pillar, of course, is a new introduction for those who are in the service industry, not producing. So this question can only be answered when you are working closely with whoever is your audit requester, or if it is yourself initiating this, then you want to be able to map out, as the other presenters have already said, all categories, all areas of your business. So 4-pillar will cover all the 4 pillars, but 2-pillar will only be looking at the labor standards and the health and safety standards. The other thing you want to discuss with your requester or amongst yourselves as a site is the audit type. Are you going for an announced audit, a semi-announced audit, or an announced audit? FedEx recommends the unannounced option, but it is open to these other types as long as there's a reason that you're going for announced. For example, the workers are not always at that particular site. That will make an announced quite difficult. The other thing that you have to discuss then when you're planning an audit is the choice of CD at the audit booking stage. So you determine which certification body you like to go with. And at BSI, we take the approach of working with you as a supplier to get this audit completed. So there are some steps that we do towards that, and I will cover them briefly in the next slide, please. Next slide. So basically, for a SMETA audit, you will conduct the CB with your inquiry for an audit. And from at that point, one of our sales team member will get in touch with you, and you have a preliminary discussion to better understand the requirement, your site operations, the scope of your operations, so that we can then tailor the audit to meet those conditions to ensure that it is meeting all the requirements. To do this, we provide you with what we call an audit booking form to be completed by your site representative and then returned to us. Next slide, please. And some of the information, the key information that we ask in that booking form may include, but it's not limited to only these ones. As I've already said, what is the audit type you want to go for? Have you discussed it with your audit requester or amongst your management team to determine whether it's going to be announced, semi-announced, or announced? You also inform us the audit structure that you are going for, 2-pillar, 4-pillar. Many times, I must add here, it's not just your decision as a site. You have to involve your buyers so that you don't end up doing a 2-pillar audit and then later on you're informed, no, we needed a 4-pillar audit, because that will incur some extra days to organize again. The other information that we require is the audit debt range. We want to know what period are you looking at having this audit, and why is this important? Because SMETA audits must be conducted or completed during the peak period when operations are at a full peak. The workforce is above 60%, preferably 80% and above. So those things determine. So if you know that your operations are not are seasonal, they are months when you're at peak, then it is always good to provide that indication of the dates that you want us to do it. The other piece of information is membership. We want to know whether you are a member of SEDEX, because before an audit, you need to register with SEDEX. And we need to know the auditee details, the name, the address of the site, the scope, the product or service that you deal with, and what is the size. Yeah. We also need to know the number of workers, what are the main languages spoken by your workforce, you provide accommodation, and such other information, because all that go into determining the duration to ensure that there's complete coverage of your operations. Next slide, please. Once we have this information, then the CD will assign an auditor or an audit team, depending whether it's a team audit. And at this point, a self-proposal suited to the details that you're providing in the booking form is prepared and presented to you for review. And if you agree with it, or if you have any input, that is discussed, and then it is signed as approval of acceptance. From that point, the client services team member at the CD takes over to schedule the audit and issues you with a confirmation letter. The auditor then follows up by preparing and issuing an audit plan, providing pre-audit pack information and details of whatever document that will be required during the audit, so that you have a chance to be ready. Next slide, please. Now, the site then submits your completed self-assessment questionnaire. These are an important document, which you do it directly in the SEDEX portal. It's a form of an internal audit, I would say, looking at what your site is by internally completing that yourself. And after that, the audit is initiated in the SEDEX portal, and the auditor follows up by conducting the audit at your site, after which a CAPA or the list of findings, if any, is shared with you at the closing meeting, and the auditor follows up by completing the report after that. And this is then submitted to you. All these are processes that are done within the SEDEX portal. So the report will be submitted to you in the SEDEX portal within 2 weeks' time. Next slide, please. Once you receive this in the SEDEX portal, the report, you have a chance to review it for accuracy, for any input, for any corrections. And once you are satisfied with it, you publish within the portal. At the point of publishing, the report becomes available to any agency, only those that you have given a right to. They could be your buyers, yourself, the people that you have given that right to view. They can be able to view the report. And then it allows you to start working on a corrective action plan, which you upload against each finding in the portal, and the auditor can then go back, review this for sufficiency. If there are any questions, come back to you, and we close those findings. If there are type of findings that require a follow-up audit on site, that means an auditor coming back on site because of the nature of the finding, then that shall also be planned, and the auditor will come over. Next slide, please. An important part of the SMETA is the provision that you, as the audit requester or the site, the supplier, you have a right to engage with your audit providers at all stages, from the point of inquiry through the planning and even through the delivery. So it's something that is openly done. So SEDEX encourages you as a key party to conduct or to clarify, to ask any questions, whether they're to do with costs, the planning, how it will go. So all that information, feel free to discuss them at the point of engagement, so that it is not something that is out. When it's happening, you are in the know, yeah. And just to say that it's important that the site takes an active part in the process. Even at the delivery point, the auditor is open as they go about the audit. If there's anything, they are sharing it openly with your team, so that you're not being caught unawares at the closing meeting. Yeah. Usually we provide you with pre-audit information at least 2 weeks before the audit, unless it is an announced audit. So at that point, you also get another chance to ask questions, clarifications, how, when those kind of issues can be discussed as the auditor shares the audit plan. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. That was really, really informative. We have the last poll for today. So we're going to get the poll up and running. And the question is, would your organisation benefit from additional support with modern slavery risk management, or SMETA? Great. Can see some answers going in there with our panel attendees and votes going in. So we'll let that run there in the background. And we have some questions. So we might commence with our question panels. I believe, Alex, you've got a few there that was directed your way. So if we can start with the first one there. Is there a specific sector or industry where there is a pattern of non-compliances that are emerging and trending?
Okay, so the sectors I would be particularly looking at are horticulture and labour hire. So anyone who has any kind of connection to labour hire providers, it's an area of concern. I would be looking at security guards, cleaning, any sectors where there's a significant amount of subcontracting and subcontracting. So that's why I mentioned cleaning and security. Obviously trolley collecting, but that's somewhat limited. But if you find a nexus to labour hire, that's obviously a concern. And then anything to do with high frequency manufacturing, short run, so promotional products is obviously an area of concern as well. That would be the kind of thing I would be principally looking at.
Thanks, Alex. There's another one here for you. If you could give organisations one piece of advice to improve their approach to tackling modern slavery tomorrow, what would it be?
So I would say the one thing you can do to really improve is communication. I know people say this, but fundamentally, having the conversation, putting aside audits and SMETA or any of this, having a conversation with your suppliers and your colleagues around what are we trying to achieve here? What are our expectations? How are we communicating that to the supplier? How are we taking them on the journey? Right? Because I think what a lot of problems stem from is a lack of understanding of what and why people are trying to achieve this. We're having an audit done. Why? What are the outcomes? Who's responsible for them? How long are we going to take to resolve them? If you can have a frank discussion that is ongoing, I think you'll address a lot of the problems. And maybe Roxanne would say that a lack of communication is probably a major cause of legal disputes. If you invest in the front end, that will pay dividends.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. And I have one last one. Maybe we can ask this across both Alex and Roxanne. So how should businesses respond when a supplier is found to be involved in modern slavery risks?
So this is a very good question. Let me pass to Roxanne first on that one from a legal perspective.
That's a great question. I think that the key to a lot of this, as I mentioned, requires really a good insight in terms of the due diligence obligations before you've even entered the stage of undertaking a commercial arrangement and setting expectations, setting conduct expectations. Once you've got an idea that an organization in your supply chain is exposed to modern slavery issues, it's really important to set the expectations about remediation and protecting those workers. And what is the exposure? Where does it sit? How significant is it from a cost, reputation, ethical obligations? All of those relevant aspects are important. So I think that that's probably the biggest point, is just making sure that you set the expectations at the outset, and where those issues are exposed, you really undertake a remediation and set the ground rules for what that looks like moving forward before entering into commercial arrangements, and making sure there's a continuous review around those processes, whether that be the audit process that Alex and Ram mentioned, but it's an ongoing process.
And just to add to that, there needs to be a victim-centric approach to any kind of remediation. So are you putting the people who are affected front and center and asking what do they want in terms of a solution, not what do you want? Because you may find that some organizations overcomplicate what they think is going to happen when the people affected are actually looking for a simpler solution. So again, that goes back to communication. But to Roxanne's point, I'd also flag, what is the capacity and the willingness for remediation within that organization? Are they going, yep, we recognize there's an issue, we're going to work with you on that? That's great. Is there that appetite to improve and resolve it? And if there is, that's a strong incentive to work with that organization rather than just go, you know what, let's part ways. Again, communication, and to Roxanne's point, are you setting the expectations at the beginning of where you want that to go? And are you following up and making sure that those are being adhered to? There's no point having a policy if nobody knows what it is and no one's willing to follow it.
Thank you. Some really great responses there to tie that in. We don't have any more questions through the discussions today. So once again, thank you, Roxanne, Alexander, and Ram, for those really informative presentations. We are now at the end of our webinar. So the panelists and our guest speakers sharing their insights and practical expertise around managing those modern slavery risks and strengthening responsible supply chains. Thanks for covering off across those different details there. Thank you to our attendees who've also joined and participated. We hope that today's session has provided some valuable guidance to you all on understanding legal obligations, applying SMETA in practice, and strengthening your organization's approach. A recording of today's webinar will be shared shortly. If you do not receive it, please contact our marketing team. I believe our contact details there are hopefully on the slides. And if you would like to learn more about BSI and how we can support your organization through SMETA audits and supply chain assurance, please visit our webinar landing page or get in touch with our team. So on that note, thank you very much, everyone, again, and happy remainder of your day. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.